Hello and welcome to the Cove's Body, Mind and Soul series. In this episode we will be looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander spirituality. Our guest speaker today is Chaplain Clint McGoldrick. Captain McGoldrick is a proud Indigenous descendant of the Warrama people of Foster Tuncurry in central north New South Wales and is due to be ordained as a deacon within the Catholic Archdiocese of Brisbane later this year. In the early 2000s, he was a combat engineer and has recently returned to military life as a chaplain. We are also joined today by Chaplain Isaac Khan, who will be assisting us with the interview. Padre, welcome and thanks for supporting the Cove. My first question to you is, what is Aboriginal and Torres Strait spirituality religion, and can you provide a brief view of ATSI framework?
Thank you for having me. Indigenous spirituality is what I'll refer to it as for this meeting, but it is a connection to a land. So it's not the land, it's a land. So around Australia we have over 300 language groups, so different mobs as we call them, so different speaking groups. And they all are within a certain landscape, so they belong to a certain part of the Australian continent, and that area that they occupy is identifiable by natural features of the land, so that hill, that river, etc. And what the Indigenous people of certain lands have is contact with the creation narrative of time. So at the start of time, ancestral beings created the earth, so the original inhabitants of the world, and what they did was they passed on laws for looking after that land to what then became the caretakers of that land. And essentially the spirituality side of it is the continuation of those stories through the generations of a place. And with that, in terms of a framework, we have law, which is LAW, and they're the physical laws of how to care for country. But then we also have law, LORE, which is the ability to be able to do those duties for carrying out the land. I put to the people that I engage with that Indigenous people have a spiritual dreaming, but also a physical dreaming. So their physical dreaming is their law, LORE, their everyday existence on the land and their duties, but then also they have connection to a spiritual dreaming, which is their stories, their ancestors, and they bring both of those together with ritual, and they connect to their ancestors. And instead of saying everywhere, I say every when. So it's timeless. It's a timeless connection to their story.
Oh, what a great description. Thank you. How does Indigenous spirituality support a believer, and what difference does it make to the individual?
So an Indigenous person who is connected to their land is connected to their spirituality. Or their spirituality comes from a connection to the land. And along with that comes community, so people who share the same stories or the same laws. The second part of your question there is more about when an Indigenous person does not have that connection to land. And that's where people cannot connect to their spirit. And that can be quite problematic. Certainly, with the history of Australian colonisation, for example, many Indigenous people were moved around the country for various reasons, and they were disconnected from their spirituality. So they weren't able to connect with their stories, with their ancestral spirits, etc. And for defence, from a pastoral and spiritual care perspective for chaplains, for example, or even Indigenous liaison officers within the ILO network, or even commanders, when you have an Indigenous soldier in front of you, we need to know where they're from, because if they're not from local, we know that there's going to be some spiritual pastoral issues along the way.
Okay, great point. How does Indigenous spirituality support defence capability?
From a soldier point of view, you're going to it's fair to say that if an Indigenous soldier presents and passes the rigorous tests to get into the Defence Force, that you're going to have a soldier that can be moulded and have capability. And I guess with any soldier that you have, if they're at their best pastorally, physically, spiritually, mentally, they're better able and have better capabilities. So I guess with an Indigenous soldier, if that pastoral spiritual care for somebody who's off country, or, we've got initiatives put in place so that that person can connect more regularly with family, or those pastoral initiatives that support people, that's going to be the best situation for any unit. From a holistic point of view, many of our operations in Australia are domestic at the moment. So we've seen even this year a lot of domestic deployments with fires last year, floods this year, and we are going onto the countries of Indigenous peoples. And I guess the conversations and the knowledge that we have towards soldiers can also then be relational, in terms of we can take them over to entering into people's lands and knowing that country, knowing the stories, the people's names, sacred places of that region, but also communicating with communities, points of reference, local contacts, who to go to for social pastoral support, etc. So many capabilities between soldiers and as a force.
How can a local commander support someone of Indigenous spirituality?
The first thing, and I guess it's you would do this for everybody, but the first point would be to ask who that person is. Where are they from? What is their story? And listening intently to and having that open-mindedness or that respect of other people's beliefs, and that, Indigenous people have lived their whole lives in that belief. And sometimes it's a bit foreign for people who haven't lived that life to understand it. So being very open-minded to listening to an Indigenous member's stories, and also listening to what is important to them. In terms of family connections, being on land, if they know their stories, but also the family supports. Also involving them in the life of the unit. Also, you'll find that a lot of Indigenous people are quite social. They have a lot of skills in relationships, or being relational with other people. And so they're always good to have in positions where we're looking to improve morale in the unit, or we're looking to engage different parts of the unit to come together.
Padre Khan, sir, any questions from you?
Yeah. Clint, that was really fascinating to listen to. I thoroughly enjoyed that. In 2012 and 2013, I participated in a couple of ACAP projects, one in Lombardina Peninsula and the sort of more the Western Australia.
Yeah.
And the second one was in the APY lands. And I just loved it. It was such an eye-opener for me as I saw the depth of spirituality in the communities. And I was actually quite surprised at the number of folk, who went to church or had a connection to sort of the long-standing missions that were in those places. So I'm very, very aware that not everyone will have a Christian connection as such, and some will also probably will have a very distinctively Indigenous expression of their Christianity or otherwise, and it may not be Christianity. Noting that my observation was that the Indigenous folk, can be quite diverse, Mm-hmm. So even those who are Christians or have Christian connections, if they are expressing their Christian faith, in say a field service or something like that, how can we be mindful of that and be encouraging the Indigenous expression of their faith? Mm-hmm. And noting also that not all of them will have a Christian experience, even though they may have had experiences or connections with missions or churches? Yeah.
I would certainly as a Catholic minister myself, I try to incorporate mindfulness into a lot of what we do, and in terms of being present in the moment and being connected to a place.
Uh-huh.
And certainly that's a Indigenous strategy, or even a tool that Indigenous people have used for thousands of years to just be still and mindful and be present. And, it's of late it's been coined as the Diri, but certainly that can be incorporated into different services. And definitely in the Christian perspective, there are similar practices. In terms of approaching, certainly in my experience, it's been 50-50. There has been an unfortunate history within Australia with the involvement of complicitness with churches in the policy of the government of the day. But on the other side of that too, we talk about the Christian message of hope. Mm-hmm. And many Indigenous people are attracted to that hope that, that there is a God, or there is a person or a narrative of Jesus who goes to the edges and goes to the people who are disenfranchised and, who are poor in spirit, poor in mind, and that hope is very attractive to many communities. So, I guess I personally go with the glass half full as opposed to glass half empty. And I like to just be, I like to work in hope as well, just to provide that positivity and draw out those positive messages from the Gospels for all people, but certainly Indigenous people if they're open to it.
Right. Thanks. Yeah, it was well said.
Padre, is there any final points you want to raise before we close it off?
No, not from me. Nothing from me.
Thank you for the opportunity to come on board. But if you do find yourself somewhere in the Defence Force in Australia or overseas, and you wanted to know more about this, certainly this year the chaplains are being empowered with knowledge to add to their already existing knowledges, but also the RAACHD network. The RAACHD network within, so that's Regional Indigenous Liaison Officers. They're concerned with connecting to community. So if you are in a position and you want to connect to the Indigenous community, certainly your RAACHD officer is the best place to start the conversation.
Well, fantastic. Thanks, Padre, and thank you for your time today. We are very grateful for the very valuable information you've provided, and I'm sure this will definitely assist our listeners. We also thank our listeners for tuning in. Our next talk will be on the Islamic faith. If you have any questions, please feel free in contacting soldiercove@gmail.com, and we'll be sure to get back to you. Don't forget to download the Cove app. It's PME in your pocket, anywhere, anytime.